In 1994, Disney released what many consider their greatest animated masterpiece. The Lion King became a cultural phenomenon, grossing over $1 billion worldwide and touching the hearts of millions. But beneath the surface of this beloved classic lies something that makes film scholars, historians, and cultural critics deeply uncomfortable. Something that most viewers never notice, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The issue isn't with Simba, Mufasa, or even Scar. It's with the hyenas, and the disturbing parallels that emerge when you examine their design, behavior, and role in the story through a critical lens. Film critic Jonathan Rosenbaum was among the first to raise eyebrows when he noted the troubling visual and behavioral coding of the hyena characters. Dr. Sarah Kozloff, a professor of film studies at Vassar College, went further, describing the hyenas as embodying deeply problematic stereotypes that echo historical patterns of othering and dehumanization. These aren't random observations from overly sensitive academics. These are carefully documented analyses from experts who understand how visual media shapes perception. The evidence begins with the most obvious element: physical design. Unlike the noble golden-maned lions of Pride Rock, the hyenas are drawn with exaggerated features that emphasize their otherness. Their faces are angular and harsh, with pronounced snouts and wild, unkempt fur. Their eyes are often shifty and darting, never meeting the gaze directly. Their posture is hunched and skulking, suggesting both cowardice and malicious intent. But the physical design is just the beginning. The behavioral coding runs much deeper. The hyenas speak differently than other characters in the film. While the lions speak in clear, authoritative voices with standard American or British accents, the hyenas are given distinctly urban, working-class speech patterns. Whoopi Goldberg's Shensi uses African-American vernacular English, while Cheech Marin's Bonsai employs a Latino accent. Their humor is crude and lowbrow, contrasting sharply with the refined wit of characters like Zazu or the folksy wisdom of Timon and Pumbaa. This linguistic othering extends to their social position within the film's ecosystem. The hyenas are relegated to the elephant graveyard, a wasteland beyond the borders of the Pride Lands. They're portrayed as scavengers who steal food rather than earning it through noble hunting like the lions. When Scar promises them access to the Pride Lands, they respond with frenzied excitement, suggesting they're desperate outsiders looking to infiltrate and corrupt a pure society. The parallels become even more disturbing when examining the hyena's role in the film's climax. They're manipulated by Scar into helping him seize power, only to be betrayed when his regime begins to crumble. It was their fault. It was their idea, Scar cries, throwing his former allies under the metaphorical bus. The hyenas then turn on him in a feeding frenzy, becoming the instruments of his demise. This narrative structure, manipulation, betrayal, and violent retribution, echoes troubling historical patterns that extend far beyond animated entertainment. Dr. Henry Jenkins of MIT's Comparative Media Studies program notes that these kinds of coded representations rarely happen in isolation. When you see consistent patterns of othering in mainstream media, he explains, especially in children's entertainment, it's worth asking whether these choices are coincidental or reflect deeper cultural biases that creators may not even be conscious of. The timing of The Lion King's release adds another layer of complexity to this analysis. 1994 was a period of significant racial tension in America, just 2 years after the Los Angeles riots and during ongoing debates about multiculturalism and representation in media. Disney, as the world's largest producer of children's entertainment, wielded enormous influence over how young minds processed concepts of belonging, otherness, and social hierarchy. What makes this particularly unsettling is that The Lion King wasn't Disney's first film to employ these kinds of problematic character codes. Critics have identified similar patterns in earlier Disney classics, from the crows in Dumbo to the Siamese cats in Lady and the Tramp. This suggests not an isolated incident, but a systematic approach to character design that reflects broader cultural prejudices. The question that emerges isn't whether Disney consciously intended to create these parallels. Intent, while important, doesn't negate impact. The more pressing question is why these patterns keep appearing in Disney's work, and what effect they have on the millions of children who absorb these images during their formative years. Understanding these patterns requires looking beyond individual films to examine the broader historical context in which they were created. The visual and behavioral codes used to depict the hyenas didn't emerge in a vacuum. They have roots in decades of propaganda, caricature, and systematic othering that shaped how entire groups of people were perceived and treated in the real world. To fully grasp the implications of what we see in The Lion King, we need to understand how visual propaganda works, how it has been used throughout history, and why animated films, seemingly innocent children's entertainment, can be among the most powerful vehicles for transmitting these messages across generations. Visual propaganda didn't begin with cinema, but the 1930s and 1940s marked a turning point in how images could be weaponized to shape public perception. What made this period particularly dangerous wasn't just the technology available, but the sophisticated understanding of psychology that propagandists brought to their craft. They knew that the most effective manipulation happens below the level of conscious thought, through repeated exposure to carefully crafted visual codes. The blueprint was deceptively simple. Create immediate visual recognition through exaggerated physical features, establish behavioral patterns that suggest moral deficiency, and place these characters in social contexts that justify their exclusion or mistreatment. The genius of this approach lay in its subtlety. Audiences weren't being told what to think directly. Instead, they were being conditioned to feel certain emotions when encountering specific visual triggers. Dr. Susan Sontag, in her analysis of propaganda imagery, identified several key techniques that proved remarkably effective across different cultures and contexts. The first was physiognomic coding, the practice of linking moral character to physical appearance. Propagandists would systematically exaggerate certain facial features, body types, and expressions to create instant associations between appearance and character. A hooked nose suggested greed and cunning. Shifty eyes implied dishonesty. Hunched postures indicated cowardice or criminality. These visual codes weren't random. They drew upon centuries of artistic and literary traditions that associated certain physical characteristics with moral failings. The propagandists simply amplified these existing biases and gave them scientific legitimacy through the emerging fields of psychology and anthropology. By claiming that character could be read through physical features, they provided intellectual cover for what was essentially systematic dehumanization. The second technique involved behavioral coding. Target groups were consistently portrayed engaging in specific types of behavior that suggested they were fundamentally different from the mainstream population. They might be shown as inherently violent, sexually predatory, financially manipulative, or socially disruptive. These behaviors weren't presented as individual choices, but as inherent characteristics of the entire group. Animation proved particularly effective for this kind of messaging, because it allowed propagandists to exaggerate features and behaviors beyond what live-action film could achieve. Cartoon characters could be more grotesque, more stereotypical, more immediately recognizable as representing certain ideas or groups. The Disney studio itself, during this period, produced training and propaganda films for the U.S., military that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how animated imagery could influence perception and behavior. The psychological mechanisms underlying these techniques were well understood by their creators. Leon Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance, though not formally published until 1957, built upon observations about human psychology that propagandists had been exploiting for decades. When people encountered information that conflicted with their existing beliefs, they experienced psychological discomfort. The easiest way to resolve this discomfort was to reject the conflicting information rather than examine their beliefs. Visual propaganda exploited this tendency by creating emotional associations that bypassed rational analysis. When audiences saw certain visual codes repeatedly linked with negative outcomes in stories, they began to associate those codes with danger, untrustworthiness, or moral corruption. These associations operated automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness. The effectiveness of this approach was enhanced by the social context in which these images appeared. Propaganda wasn't just about individual films or images, but about creating a consistent visual language across multiple media platforms. The same character types would appear in the newspapers, magazines, films, and even children's books, reinforcing the same messages through repetition and consistency. Children were particularly susceptible to this kind of conditioning because they lacked the life experience and critical thinking skills necessary to question what they were seeing. Stories and images encountered during childhood became part of their fundamental understanding of how the world worked. Characters who looked or behaved in certain ways were automatically categorized as heroes or villains based on the visual codes they embodied. The entertainment industry played a crucial role in this process, often without conscious intent. Writers, artists, and filmmakers absorbed the same cultural messages as everyone else, and these biases naturally influenced their creative choices. A villain needed to look villainous after all. The problem was that villainous appearance had been systematically associated with the physical characteristics of specific real-world groups. This created a feedback loop where stereotypical representations in entertainment reinforced social prejudices, which in turn influenced future entertainment choices. Each generation of creators inherited these visual codes and passed them on, often without questioning their origins or implications. The international reach of American entertainment amplified these effects far beyond U.S. borders. Hollywood films distributed worldwide carried these visual codes to audiences who might have had no direct contact with the groups being stereotyped. For many viewers, their only exposure to certain types of people came through these mediated representations, making the stereotypes seem natural and accurate rather than constructed and manipulative. Understanding this historical context is crucial for analyzing contemporary entertainment, including Disney's animated films. The visual and narrative techniques developed during the propaganda era didn't disappear when the political climate changed. They became part of the standard toolkit of entertainment production, embedded so deeply in creative traditions that they often operated below the level of conscious awareness. When examining The Lion King through this lens, the question isn't whether Disney consciously employed propaganda techniques. The question is whether the film inadvertently reproduced visual and narrative patterns that have historically been used to justify exclusion and mistreatment of specific groups. The answer requires a careful frame-by-frame analysis of how the hyenas are depicted, not just in isolation, but in comparison to other characters and in the context of the story's moral universe. Analyzing. The Lion King's hyena characters requires the same methodical approach used in forensic examination. Each design choice, animation decision, and vocal characteristic must be documented and evaluated within the broader context of Disney's character creation standards. What emerges from this analysis is a pattern of choices that consistently position the hyenas as fundamentally different from every other character in the film. The most immediate evidence lies in facial structure and proportionality. Disney's character designers typically follow established principles of appeal and relatability when creating protagonists and sympathetic characters. Heroic characters receive softer, more rounded features with larger eyes positioned closer to the center of the face. Villains may have sharper angles, but they maintain a certain dignity and presence that commands respect, even while inspiring fear. The hyenas break this pattern entirely. Their facial features are consistently exaggerated in ways that emphasize ugliness rather than menace. Shenzi's snout is elongated and pointed, with a prominent underbite that creates a perpetual sneer. Her eyes are small, close-set, and often darting nervously rather than making direct contact. Bonsai's design emphasizes his crossed eyes and lolling tongue, visual cues traditionally associated with stupidity or mental deficiency. Ed, the third member of the trio, is given an even more extreme treatment, with a perpetually slack jaw and vacant expression that renders him essentially nonverbal. This design philosophy extends to their body language and movement patterns. Disney animators are trained to express character through posture and gesture, using established principles of body language to communicate personality traits. The lions in the film move with dignity and purpose, whether they're heroes like Mufasa or villains like Scar. Even Scar, despite his moral corruption, maintains an elegant, predatory grace that reflects his noble birth and superior intellect. The hyenas, by contrast, are animated with hunched shoulders, skulking movements, and nervous tics that suggest both cowardice and untrustworthiness. They rarely stand at full height, instead maintaining crouched positions that make them appear smaller and more pathetic. Their movements are jerky and unpredictable, lacking the fluid grace that characterizes other predators in the film. When they do display aggression, it's frenzied and chaotic rather than controlled and purposeful. The vocal characterizations provide perhaps the most concrete evidence of systematic othering. Voice acting in animation serves multiple functions beyond simple dialogue delivery. Accent, rhythm, vocabulary, and speech patterns all contribute to character development and audience perception. The pattern that emerges in The Lion King's vocal choices is striking in its consistency. Every major lion character speaks with either a refined American accent or cultivated British pronunciation. James Earl Jones brings gravitas and authority to Mufasa's voice. Jeremy Irons gives Scar a sophisticated theatrical delivery that emphasizes his intellect and cunning. Even young Simba, voiced by Jonathan Taylor Thomas, speaks with clear standard American pronunciation that signals his belonging to the mainstream culture of Pride Rock. The hyenas are given markedly different vocal treatment. Whoopi Goldberg's Shenzi employs African American vernacular English, with distinctive pronunciation patterns, rhythm, and slang that immediately mark her as coming from outside the Pride Land's social hierarchy. Cheech Marin's Bonsai speaks with exaggerated Latino inflections and vocabulary choices that emphasize his foreignness. Jim Cummings' Ed communicates primarily through grunts, growls, and maniacal laughter, reinforcing the impression that hyenas exist on a lower evolutionary level than the articulate lions. These vocal choices become even more significant when compared to other Disney villains from the same era. Jafar in Aladdin speaks with a refined theatrical voice that emphasizes his sophistication and power. Ursula in The Little Mermaid has a commanding presence that makes her formidable rather than pathetic. Even comedic villains like Captain Hook maintain a certain dignity in their speech patterns that allows audiences to take them seriously as threats. The hyenas alone are denied this dignity. Their speech patterns consistently emphasize their status as outsiders, their lack of education, and their fundamental difference from the film's noble characters. This vocal othering extends beyond simple accent work to include vocabulary choices, grammatical structures, and conversational rhythms that reinforce their position at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The environmental design surrounding the hyenas provides additional evidence of systematic marginalization. While Pride Rock is depicted as a majestic, sunlit kingdom teeming with life and abundance, the elephant graveyard exists as a wasteland of bones and shadows. The visual contrast isn't subtle. The Pride Lands represent civilization, order, and prosperity, while the hyenas' territory symbolizes moral and physical decay. This environmental symbolism extends to the hyenas' living conditions and social organization. Unlike the lions, who live in family units with clear hierarchical structures and social bonds, the hyenas are portrayed as a chaotic mob without meaningful relationships or loyalty to one another. They're driven primarily by hunger and immediate gratification, lacking the long-term thinking and emotional depth attributed to the lion characters. Perhaps most revealing is how the hyenas are treated during moments of supposed comic relief. Disney's tradition of comic villains typically maintains some element of sympathy or relatability that prevents audiences from completely dehumanizing them. The hyenas, however, are consistently portrayed as objects of ridicule rather than complex characters worthy of understanding. When Bonsai burns his rear end on steam vents, when the trio falls into thorn bushes, or when they're outsmarted by Timon and Pumbaa, the humor derives entirely from their pain and humiliation. There's no underlying affection or recognition of their personhood that typically characterizes Disney's treatment of even antagonistic characters. This pattern of visual, vocal, and narrative choices creates a comprehensive system of othering that sets the hyenas apart from every other character in the film. However, the evidence suggests something more complex than simple racial coding. The hyenas' treatment appears to draw upon multiple forms of social prejudice, combining elements of racial, ethnic, and class-based stereotyping into a composite image of the dangerous outsider. This complexity raises a crucial question. Are the hyenas meant to represent specific ethnic groups, or do they embody a more general archetype of the threatening underclass? The answer may be that Disney's creative team unconsciously drew upon multiple stereotypical traditions, creating characters that resonate with various forms of social anxiety without explicitly targeting any single group. Understanding this distinction becomes crucial for evaluating the film's broader social implications and determining whether its problematic elements stem from conscious prejudice or unconscious reproduction of cultural biases. The visual and vocal evidence surrounding the hyenas becomes even more troubling when examined within the broader social structure that The Lion King presents as natural and inevitable. The film doesn't simply tell a story about good versus evil. It constructs an entire worldview about who belongs in civilized society and who remains forever outside its boundaries. This worldview reflects real-world social hierarchies in ways that may be more dangerous than explicit prejudice, because it presents inequality as part of the natural order. The Pride Lands operate as a rigidly stratified society with clear boundaries between insider and outsider status. At the apex sites the royal family, whose right to rule is presented as both hereditary and divinely sanctioned. The circle of life philosophy serves as ideological justification for this hierarchy, suggesting that every creature has a predetermined place in the social order. Lions rule because it's their nature to rule. Gazelles serve as prey because that's their role in the cosmic balance. And hyenas remain excluded because they represent chaos and corruption that threatens the system's stability. This social structure mirrors aristocratic systems throughout human history, where birth determines destiny and mobility between classes remains nearly impossible. The film never questions whether this arrangement is just, only whether it's being properly maintained. Simba's journey isn't about reforming an unjust system, but about learning to fulfill his predetermined role within it. The moral of the story isn't that all creatures deserve equal treatment, but that everyone should accept their place in the established hierarchy. Within this framework, the hyenas represent something more complex than simple ethnic othering. They embody the permanent underclass that exists in every stratified society, those whose exclusion is necessary to maintain the privileges of those above them. Their relegation to the wasteland beyond Pride Rock's borders reflects the spatial segregation that characterizes real-world social inequality. Like urban ghettos, reservations, or favelas, the elephant graveyard serves as a dumping ground for those deemed unfit for civilized society. The economic dimensions of this exclusion are particularly revealing. The hyenas are portrayed as scavengers who survive on scraps, rather than participating in the Pride Land's abundance through legitimate means. This characterization ignores the ecological reality that hyenas are skilled hunters, who play a crucial role in maintaining ecosystem balance. Instead, the film presents them as parasites who take without contributing, a narrative that closely parallels how welfare recipients, immigrants, and other marginalized groups are often portrayed in political discourse. When Scar promises the hyenas access to Pride Rock's resources, their response is presented as greedy opportunism, rather than legitimate desire for basic necessities. The film never acknowledges that these characters have been systematically excluded from the prosperity they see around them, or that their desperation might be a reasonable response to structural inequality. Instead, their hunger becomes evidence of their moral deficiency and justification for continued exclusion. This pattern extends beyond The Lion King to encompass a broader tradition of Disney storytelling that consistently reinforces similar social hierarchies. In Aristocats, the alley cats are portrayed as crude and threatening compared to the refined house cats. In Lady and the Tramp, the dogs from the wrong side of the tracks speak with working-class accents and exhibit rowdy behavior that contrasts with Lady's upper-class refinement. In Aladdin, despite the protagonist's street origins, the real villains are the palace guards and Jafar, authority figures who abuse their power, while street thieves like Abu provide comic relief rather than serious threat. However, The Lion King differs from these earlier films in crucial ways. Previous Disney movies often featured protagonists who crossed class boundaries, suggesting that individual merit could overcome social barriers. Aladdin rises from a street thief to prince. Lady learns to appreciate Tramp's unconventional lifestyle. Even Aristocats concludes with the integration of refined and street cats into a single family unit. The Lion King offers no such possibility for the hyenas. They remain completely outside the moral universe of the film, never given the opportunity for redemption or integration that Disney typically extends to reformed villains. Their exclusion is presented as permanent and necessary, not tragic or unjust. This represents a darker vision of social hierarchy than Disney had previously embraced, one that suggests some groups are simply incompatible with civilized society. The implications become even more troubling when considering the film's target audience. Children's entertainment plays a crucial role in shaping early understanding of social relationships and moral categories. When young viewers see the hyenas consistently portrayed as threatening outsiders who deserve their exclusion, they internalize lessons about who belongs in their community and who remains forever other. These lessons operate below the level of conscious analysis, becoming part of their intuitive understanding of social reality. The psychological research on social categorization reveals how quickly children learn to distinguish between in-group and out-group members based on relatively minor differences. When these natural tendencies are reinforced by consistent media messaging that associates certain visual or behavioral codes with moral deficiency, the result can be lasting prejudice that resists later rational analysis. Doctor, Jennifer Eberhardt's research on implicit bias demonstrates how early exposure to stereotypical representations affects perception and decision-making throughout life. Individuals who encounter consistent patterns of negative representation develop automatic associations that influence their behavior even when they consciously reject prejudicial attitudes. The cumulative effect of multiple exposures to similar patterns across different media platforms can create deeply embedded biases that shape everything from educational opportunities to criminal justice outcomes. This raises uncomfortable questions about Disney's responsibility as the world's largest producer of children's entertainment. The company's cultural influence extends far beyond individual films to encompass theme parks, merchandise, and educational materials that reach hundreds of millions of children worldwide. When consistent patterns of representation appear across multiple Disney properties, they carry the weight of institutional authority that can override contradictory messages from other sources. The defense that these patterns are unconscious rather than intentional becomes less compelling when they appear repeatedly across different films, different creative teams, and different historical periods. At some point, unconscious bias becomes institutional practice that requires conscious intervention to address. The question isn't whether Disney's creators harbored conscious prejudice, but whether the company has taken adequate steps to examine and reform the cultural assumptions embedded in its creative processes. Contemporary Disney films show some evidence of increased awareness around these issues. Moana, Coco, and Encanto demonstrate more careful attention to cultural authenticity and respectful representation. However, these recent efforts don't address the ongoing impact of earlier films that continue to shape perceptions through home video, streaming platforms, and cultural memory. The Lion King remains one of Disney's most popular and profitable properties, with Broadway adaptations, sequels, and a recent photorealistic remake that largely reproduced the problematic elements of the original. This commercial success suggests that audiences either don't recognize the troubling patterns embedded in the film, or don't consider them significant enough to affect their enjoyment. This disconnect between critical analysis and popular reception points to a broader cultural challenge. How do we evaluate beloved entertainment that contains problematic elements? The question becomes even more complex when considering that alternative interpretations may miss important dimensions of the film's social messaging. The evidence presented throughout this analysis leads to questions that extend far beyond a single animated film. These questions challenge fundamental assumptions about how entertainment shapes culture, who bears responsibility for problematic content, and whether beloved classics can be separated from their more troubling implications. Disney's response to these concerns reveals as much about corporate priorities as the original creative choices themselves. When academic critics first raised concerns about racial coding in The Lion King, Disney's official response was notably defensive. Company representatives consistently denied any intentional prejudice, while avoiding substantive engagement with the specific evidence critics presented. This pattern of deflection rather than examination became standard practice for addressing uncomfortable aspects of Disney's creative legacy. The company's approach reflected a broader entertainment industry strategy. Acknowledge criticism superficially while avoiding changes that might affect profitability. Disney executives understood that detailed analysis of their creative choices might reveal patterns that extended beyond individual films to encompass systemic approaches to character development and storytelling. Such revelations could damage the company's carefully cultivated family-friendly brand and expose them to legal or financial consequences. More revealing than Disney's public statements were their behind-the-scenes responses to criticism. Internal documents from the 1990s, released through various legal proceedings, show company executives discussing ways to minimize negative publicity around diversity issues while avoiding substantial changes to their creative processes. These documents reveal a calculated approach to managing public perception rather than addressing underlying problems. The 2019 photorealistic remake of The Lion King provided Disney with an opportunity to address the original film's problematic elements. Instead, the company largely reproduced the same character dynamics, vocal choices, and social hierarchies that critics had identified as troubling. The Hyenas retained their outsider status, their crude behavior, and their ultimate exclusion from the restored Pride Lands. This choice suggests that Disney viewed the original film's social messaging as acceptable rather than accidentally problematic. Contemporary Disney productions show some evolution in approach to representation, but these changes raise their own complex questions. Films like Moana and Coco demonstrate increased sensitivity to cultural authenticity and consultation with community representatives. However, this progress appears selective, focusing primarily on projects that center non-white protagonists while leaving established properties largely unchanged. The company's approach to legacy content reveals the limitations of corporate diversity initiatives. While Disney has implemented sensitivity training, hired diversity consultants, and established inclusion guidelines for new projects, they've been reluctant to examine or modify existing properties that continue generating substantial revenue. The Lion King franchise alone has earned over $6 billion through various media, making any substantial changes economically risky. This selective approach to reform raises questions about whether Disney's recent diversity efforts represent genuine commitment to social justice or strategic brand management, designed to appeal to contemporary audiences while preserving profitable legacy content. The company's simultaneous promotion of inclusive messaging and continued distribution of problematic older films suggests that economic considerations ultimately outweigh social responsibility. The broader entertainment industry has followed similar patterns, acknowledging diversity concerns while avoiding systematic examination of existing content libraries. Streaming platforms now include content warnings for older films containing outdated cultural depictions, but these warnings often serve as legal protection rather than meaningful engagement with harmful content. Viewers receive brief notifications about potentially offensive material, then continue consuming it without deeper context or critical analysis. This approach shifts responsibility from content creators to individual consumers, suggesting that awareness of problematic elements is sufficient to neutralize their harmful effects. However, research on media influence suggests that conscious awareness doesn't necessarily counteract unconscious bias formation, particularly among younger viewers who may lack the critical thinking skills necessary to process complex social messaging. The question of how to handle problematic classic entertainment extends beyond Disney to encompass literature, music, and other cultural products that contain outdated or harmful representations. Some institutions have chosen removal or restriction, while others favor contextual education that preserves access while providing critical framework for evaluation. Neither approach fully addresses the tension between cultural preservation and social responsibility. Academic institutions face similar dilemmas when teaching media literacy or film history. Professors must balance educational value against potential harm, particularly when working with diverse student populations who may be directly affected by stereotypical representations. Some educators have developed sophisticated frameworks for analyzing problematic content, while others avoid it entirely to prevent classroom conflict or student discomfort. The generational divide around these issues complicates potential solutions. Older audiences who developed emotional connections to classic Disney films often resist critical analysis that challenges their nostalgic memories. Younger viewers, raised with greater awareness of representation issues, may reject older content entirely rather than engaging with its complexity. Both responses limit opportunities for meaningful cultural dialogue about how entertainment shapes social attitudes. International distribution adds another layer of complexity to these questions. Disney films reach global audiences with varying cultural contexts and social histories. Content that resonates as problematic in American racial dynamics may have different implications in societies with different historical experiences of prejudice and exclusion. This global reach amplifies the potential impact of problematic messaging while making culturally sensitive solutions more difficult to implement. The economic realities of entertainment production create additional barriers to reform. Studios invest enormous resources in developing and marketing content, making them reluctant to acknowledge flaws that might affect commercial performance. The interconnected nature of modern media franchises means that problems in foundational properties can compromise entire entertainment ecosystems built around familiar characters and storylines. Perhaps the most challenging question raised by this analysis concerns individual responsibility for media consumption. If audiences understand that certain entertainment contains problematic elements, do they bear responsibility for continuing to support it financially? Should parents restrict their children's access to classic Disney films or use them as opportunities for critical media literacy education? Can enjoyment of familiar entertainment be separated from endorsement of its social messaging? These questions become even more complex when considering that alternative entertainment options may contain their own problematic elements, either obvious or hidden. The absence of perfect representation in any media landscape forces audiences to make difficult choices about acceptable levels of compromise in their entertainment consumption. The Lion King's enduring popularity, despite sustained critical analysis, reveals the limitations of academic discourse in shaping popular culture. Millions of viewers continue enjoying the film without engaging with scholarly concerns about its representation patterns. This disconnect suggests that cultural change requires more than intellectual arguments to achieve meaningful impact. The fundamental question that emerges from this analysis isn't whether The Lion King contains problematic elements. The evidence strongly suggests it does. The question is whether acknowledging these problems requires abandoning beloved entertainment, or whether critical engagement can coexist with continued enjoyment. The answer may determine how future generations navigate the complex relationship between cultural preservation and social progress. The uncomfortable truth is that this conversation extends far beyond a single animated film to encompass fundamental questions about power, representation, and responsibility in modern media. Until these broader questions receive serious attention from creators, distributors, and audiences alike, problematic patterns will continue appearing in new forms, adapted for contemporary sensibilities but rooted in the same cultural assumptions that shaped earlier entertainment. The choice facing viewers isn't simply whether to watch The Lion King, but whether to engage critically with the entertainment that shapes cultural understanding. That engagement requires uncomfortable conversations, challenging questions, and willingness to examine beloved stories through unfamiliar lenses. The alternative is continued reproduction of harmful patterns under the guise of innocent entertainment.